Do you also have a really hard time right now? A hard time with finding space, mental, emotional space to have fun, to just enjoy life, to have pleasure? Does it feel much more that this is a time of stress, anxiety, or maybe anger and fighting and trying just to keep the head down or above water and moving forward?
Hi, this is Dr. Friedemann, and you're watching Empowerment Solutions. Do you struggle with anxiety, stress, low self-esteem, or a general sense of powerlessness? Well, in this podcast, me and my expert guests share with you tools, tips, and strategies on how to overcome these struggles using the power of your conscious and subconscious mind so that you can live with greater joy, peace, and empowered authenticity.
Mike, it's so nice to have you in Empowerment Solutions. And I like to, just jump right into it because I read about your journey to being really interested in fun coming from a not so fun place. I mean, it seemed like you were actually a little down with yourself in life, and then you started to reshape how you wanted to approach also fun. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so sort of the beginning of the origin story was to kind of, condense it. I got early mentorship through an amazing psychologist by the name of Michael Gervais. He's now pretty well known for his mindfulness training, especially here in the States. He became the sports psychologist for the Seattle Seahawks, but I got access to him when he was still getting his clinical hours. And so it was at a time where I was really trying to develop concepts of peak performance. I was in the midst of a couple entrepreneurial endeavors. And so my foray into psychology was really how can we use it to better ourselves. And during that time, about 2005-ish, Seligman had made Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow popular, especially here in the States. He had a book come out called Authentic Happiness, and he started something, him and his colleagues started something called the International Positive Psychology Association, which I got invited to be a charter member of. And so since that time, had really drank from the cup of positive psych research, right? And used a lot of those tools for my own betterment. And also have always been kind of a quantified self geek. So, would track like what was working, self-experimentation and things of that nature. And up until 2016, really had been a zealot of, trying to optimize happiness the best that you can. And as you alluded, I had this kind of trifecta of unfortunate events happen in that year. I lost my younger brother quite suddenly to a pulmonary embolism. I have a slant towards anxiety, and how I mitigate that is endurance sport, and found out the two aren't correlated at all, but found out a couple months after my brother's death that I had at some point injury that I didn't know about, and had developed advanced osteoarthritis and needed a hip replacement. So I wasn't going to be able to run again. So this lifelong way of mitigating anxiety was sort of taken away from me. And then this isn't necessarily bad, misfortune, but my wife got an amazing opportunity that's brought us to North Carolina, but we were living in California and had been throughout our marriage. And so that meant uprooting, from our support network, from family and friends, which are, a great way to sort of mitigate stress when it happens. And so I had these two unfortunate events, and I didn't have my network available. And so I kept trying to use these tools that have been effective for over a decade, to make myself happy. And I found that the more I chased happiness by the tail, the more miserable I was becoming. And being a good researcher, I wanted to understand why, right? And through some serendipity, and mainly through social psychology, not necessarily clinical psychology, there was this emerging understanding that folks that not necessarily value happiness, because it's fine to value happiness as a construct, but folks that are overly concerned with happiness, especially their own happiness, tend to be less happy. In fact, it quite often, has a strong correlation to really significant mental illness like bipolar disorder and major depressive disorder. And so why that is, again, it's a correlation, not a causation, but it's clear that people that perseverate on why they're not where they want to be make themselves miserable. And so I was doing that, unbeknownst to me. The more I tried to use these tools and pick them apart of why they weren't working and why I wasn't unhappy, ultimately that was bleeding into my identity as being an unhappy person and making me more miserable. So if these tools were no longer effective, what was there? And so I started digging in and realized, especially from my previous research in organizational psychology, this idea that autonomy is a really useful tool to bring back strong mental well-being, right? And so what could I do to sort of build my breadth of emotional response with still identifying as unhappy being an appropriate response to my brother passing away? And I found that anyone can still bring in joy and delight into their life and still identify with negative emotion, right? You can still have these experiences of what we call in clinical psychology positive valence, and still identify with the malaise or sort of the melancholy that's happening in your life if that's an appropriate response at that time. And so there are two things to pick apart here, right? And they're foundational with cognitive behavioral therapy. We know that introspection tends to be what either creates downward spirals or upward spirals, right? And so if we're perseverating consistently on why we're not happy, but not taking action, ultimately those thoughts have this weight that sort of drags us down over time, right? It bleeds into our identity. We have less vitality to do things that could potentially lead to our betterment. Where if, despite our emotional state, we realize that we have some wherewithal, and this is, again, I always want to qualify, there's some people with a biological predisposition to depression where this might not work, right? If you're, in the throes of major fibromyalgia or, treatment-resistant depression, it's not like you can just will yourself out of those. So I don't want to make, like bold statements that fun is going to get you out of a true clinical condition, right? But if you're really just in a state of, like myself, where the period of time sucks, but I still want to go out and feel some pleasurable aspects of what life has to offer, and realize that those are abundant even when things are sucky, for lack of a better way of saying it, that those are accessible to everyone. And so that's what I really started digging in. And it parallels right there with behavioral science, that whenever we're able to manipulate our outcomes, bias ourselves towards positive outcomes, or manipulate our environment, just make it more pleasurable to be in, that ultimately those have an upward spiral lift, right? Because we start to realize that life has a positive slant if we sort of move in that direction. And so that's why fun as a construct has really been so interesting to me, from the lens of scientists, because it really is this tool that everyone has access to. And we can use it at any given time, even for things that aren't that great. We can look at them mindfully and go, okay, so how in this instance could I potentially make it more pleasurable for me?
So which tools did not work anymore when you said tools didn't work anymore?
So
besides running?
Primarily for me, it was gratitude journaling. The more that I kind of tried to find things to be grateful for. And this work comes from Sonia Lubomirsky out of UC Riverside. She's now empirically validated this, that folks that overprescribe to this, and because it's kind of, especially here in the States, I don't know about France, but life coaches have kind of grabbed onto it and accentuated what, the true intervention value is of gratitude. And so, I kept trying to be like, okay, well, I want to be grateful for something. And I wasn't really grateful at that time. I had some really unfortunate events, and processing those and mourning my brother's death were more important than going outside and whimsically trying to find things to be grateful for. And so that was one that was, quite problematic. And the other was, trying to now optimize to get myself back on the rails. So like trying to find things to be happy for. So in line with sort of gratitude as well. trying to savor things without processing what was right in front of me really did become problematic. So, sort of lower level tools of mindfulness, trying to savor my way out of melancholy just ended up being problematic because I couldn't just compartmentalize those feelings. And we now know that from the hedonic flexibility principle, right? This comes out of Oxford, MIT, and Stanford, that when people try to limit their breadth of emotions, by using these sort of lower level tools of saying, okay, well, I can will myself out of things that you really shouldn't yet, because you should, experience a broad breadth of emotion. That's when things become quite problematic, because the brain needs to process bad activities, bad things. And that's an unfortunate aspect of life, right? I mean, change is inevitable. We're going to lose loved ones. Some of us are going to lose our partners, et cetera, right? And turning a blind eye to that by overly using tools of positive psychology, despite, negative valence and negative emotional states, again, now has been empirically validated to, that we need that, it's part of the human condition.
Yeah. So when you said it's, either an upwards or a downward spiral, I mean, what if it can be neither? What if it's like a middle where you just stay in this mindful acceptance of whatever you're experiencing? I mean, is it necessary always to go one way or the other, or can we just be in the middle somewhere?
No, you absolutely can be in the middle. So oftentimes that's a question I get all the time, right? For me, I do have a bias of wanting pleasurable states, right? Like, I love to have fun with my children. I love to, engage in pro-social behavior with my friends. But Susan Cain just wrote an amazing book called Bittersweet, where she talks about that very thing, that there's, depending on where you fall on the big five, there are plenty of folks that like to be in a neutral valent state, where they're not necessarily happy or sad. And if that is what you're predisposed to, that's not necessarily bad. And there's some folks that like to be in a melancholy state. Think of, I'm not trying to trivialize it, but like folks that enjoy goth music and things of that nature. Certainly, you don't want to devoid yourself of pleasure, because we know, similar to folks that overemphasize happiness, you overemphasize sadness and don't broaden and build those emotions, you're going to run into similar problems. But certainly, if you have a predisposition to being sad, that's not necessarily bad either, right? And so, absolutely, if you want to go down the middle, I think what is problematic is if that you're flat all the time, so you tend to be apathic. You're going to start to lose mirror neurons. You're going to lose the ability to be empathic. You're going to not understand why kindness is important. So it would be problematic if you don't sort of deviate from that. But if that's your set point, we talk about the hedonic set point, and that's sort of, where your comfort zone lies, then that's perfectly acceptable.
Well, I think what you so beautifully said is this, need that, we have to be happy, that can put more stress in us than it actually lets us, unfold life, or even grow into, whatever we meant to be, or we want to grow into, based also on the circumstances we're in. I mean, when you lost your brother, or I lost my parents, these are very challenging situations, but they also shape you as a human being. And so just this need, okay, I need to have pleasure, I need to have happiness, that can certainly also put more pressure on yourself to skip over it, like you just mentioned, than really also savor the gifts in it, because any loss is also certainly something that can teach us something. Like you said, sometimes there is joy in the hardship, or you can find more joy in the hardship. And what did you mean with that? That, there is a way to maybe be more appreciative of the small joys that present themselves, or how did you see that?
Yeah. So in researching the book and also processing, my own feelings about what had happened, I was impressed to find out that the folks that accept death, and so not necessarily fear death, which is different. Again, this, I want to make sure, because semantics is important, that I nuance, similar to valuing happiness and being concerned about happiness. This is the same distinction with death. So accepting that death is coming and not necessarily worrying about the inevitability really allows us to be more in the moment with the time that we have, right? Because we realize that these experiences that we have are finite. And when we start to realize that, a couple of things happen. And one of the most important is that when we index a whole host of experiences, so, no matter what you like with regards to arousal and valence, still indexing a bunch of different experiences through opportunities for wonder and awe and betterment, these get encoded into our brain as separate experiences rather than someone that kind of lives a habitual life, right? And through, refined heuristics and things like that, where if you ask them what they did in a given month, they could kind of just give you a summary of their day. When people index things and are appreciative that time is finite, we tend to hold these memories as an index timeline, which allows us to look back and have this richer set of experiences that helps us build resilience. And so that's why it becomes particularly important as a tool of mindfulness, to reiterate what you said, to be joyful in the things that we do have, appreciate what we do have, because abundance is there, right? But at the end of the day, the one thing that isn't abundant is time. And so using time usefully is one of the best things that we can do.
Now, coming back to the fundamental word, fun and happiness, how would you describe both and what's the difference between them?
Yeah, so fun is an action orientation, right? And so fun is, again, to define it academically in the simplest terms, it's anything that we derive pleasure from, right? So in clinical psychology, we would say it's anything on the positive side of valence, anything that we're going, hey, this is an enjoyable activity, right? Happiness with regards to psychology is something, we describe it within the construct of subjective well-being, right? And so we've now really pull it out with these numeric measures, based on Likert scales. And that's unfortunate because and again, it's just a definition, right? But it requires introspection to say, hey, was I happy, within this time period, whether that's, longitudinal time period of 5 years or was I happy yesterday? And why that becomes problematic is whenever we sort of need to dissect whether or not we were happy, all of a sudden we're becoming concerned with happiness. So it's, again, I like using the metaphor of chasing a tiger by its tail, right? Because as soon as we go looking for it, all of a sudden it's kind of magically disappeared. But when we start to live life, the way in alignment with our identity and our values and where we want to go directionally, then happiness is generally a good lagging indicator of how we're living. Does that make sense?
Yes. I mean, it's definitely an overused word. And, with my clients, I often hear them saying once, we work on, okay, what do you would love to experience instead of anxiety? Oh, I just want to be happy. But happy is such a wide step from how they are feeling, because the way we define happiness is something like, wow, this is so amazing and I'm just really having so much joy. Aren't there like way more nuances about happiness? I mean, can you just have a cup of coffee on a Sunday morning and the kids are quiet, it's a beautiful day, and it can be completely peaceful, equal happy?
Yeah, and so that's what I've seen. I'm an organizational psychologist, to make that clear. So, but in working with clinical psychologists that work with coaches, my favorite is Dr. Iris Mouse out of Cal Berkeley, and she had put it to me this way: like when you do have a client or patient that comes in with that kind of conundrum, you need them to really define it themselves, because to your point, oftentimes what they're doing is being prescribed what happiness is, right? And especially here in the Western world, it becomes quite problematic because a lot of it's influenced by marketing, right? I think it's one that I'm immersing myself in now. It's not necessarily talked about in the book, but that I find quite fascinating is the way that collectivist cultures and individualist cultures experience happiness, because happiness is really experienced as a group. in collectivist cultures, and here, especially in the States, we're really worried about individual happiness. And so to answer your question, more with a Western slant, because that's what I'm more familiar with, that is where you need to start. Like, okay, well, let's first find happiness, because probably half of your problem is that you don't know what happiness means to you, right? And it could mean 6 different things, right? When we look at a coaching paradigm, sometimes it could be just alleviating pain. Like, I'm in so much either physical or emotional pain, I can't be happy. Okay, well, let's work at, in those big boulders. To your point, it could be that someone's just lonely in this particular period. And so they're trying to figure out, what are all these things, again, these tools of positive psych that I see on TikTok, and why aren't they working for me? Well, it's as simple as you just calling up that old friend, that you become distanced from because of the pandemic or whatever the reason is, and just habituating, that connection again. And that's going to lead to you feeling more fulfilled. And so this ambiguous definition of happiness, you're spot on. That becomes one of the biggest problems when someone's trying to, quote unquote, solve their happiness issue.
Well, plus it makes them feel that they're constantly failing, because
Correct.
their ability to get to that, what they see on Instagram as being happy or TikTok as being happy, is never reachable for them. And so they just give up at some point. So yeah, I love what you said, that it's really important to define it for yourself, and maybe even put a different word. I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be for you that happiness is your holy grail of the state of being. It could be something completely different. And
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I think, again, boiling back to semantics and revisiting your earlier question, that's why I think fun as a construct is so much more interesting, right? Because fun allows us immediate wins, right? Like at any given time, maybe you need to wait a couple hours or a couple days, but you can take action towards making certain aspects of your life more pleasurable. And happiness is always a lagging indicator, where you're looking at where you are today and where you want to be. And again, what we know from the science is that starts to affect your identity, because when you continually look at the gap between, here and now and your future state, you're going to start to go, I am an unhappy person, because by definition, you are, with the way that you're framing it, right? So if you can reframe it in a way that, one, happiness is somewhat an illusion, right? I mean, why happiness also is problematic is that to some degree, it's this collective hallucination that we have, right? Because it relies to some degree on your happenstance, right? We know that happiness is a construct that's based in comparing, right? So why is it that, folks from lower economic areas can be much more happier than folks from higher economic areas, right? And that's because they're comparing themselves to their peers. And that is a big component of happiness, right? It's why we know from lottery studies that when people win, have these huge windfalls, that yes, they become a lot more excited and happier for about a year, but then they return to where they were, because, again, we start to compare ourselves once we adapt to our new surroundings and new circumstances. And we also adapt, a component of feeling pleasure is based in evolution, right? I mean, sex is enjoyable because we're meant to procreate. High caloric food is enjoyable because food used to be scarce, right? And so these things are meant to light us up for a little bit and then be fleeting, because that's what they were meant to do, to move us towards behaviors that would help our species survive. We live in a much different world then, right? Like, we haven't caught up to those. And so defining what it is and being mindful of that then becomes a lot more useful, because you can say, I have arrived, and then you can start to practice savoring in that moment. Like, I don't need more than this relationship with my friend, or I don't need more than this close connection I have with my partner, or I'm going to enjoy the journey of mastering a new sport or a new instrument or a new hobby, because just being in that is what makes me happy. I mean, it's a cliche, but there's some truth in it, right? That happiness really does live in the journey, but so often we're sold the destination, right? Like, once we arrive, then we can check the box and tell everyone we're happy. That just, you can survey 1 billion people. That's just not reality. But for some reason, that's what we believe, and it's problematic.
I think really that in our society, the problem is also that we are making happiness more and more complicated and expensive. There's just
Yes.
something about this oversaturation of what is possible and the instant gratification we all want. And then you have your new watch or you have your, fun cruise. And in the end, it's never really lasting because it's already on the top of so many other things that you just gave yourself as a pleasurable experience. We go for a 3 week hike on the Compostelle in France, and that's very simple. It's very basic. And I'm not really thinking about the destination. I'm really thinking about just this everyday one step of a time, and it brings so much happiness because it's so, yeah, just again, very basic. Do you think we need to go back a little bit to just really go to those maybe more pleasurable senses that are achievable and available, that are not about that big thing that we are then posting on social media about?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things to unpack there, right? One, and this isn't new, right? I think people just need a reminder is that we know this has been proven empirically time and time again that experience is better than things, right? And so, and the reason for that is one, it's usually a we proposition, not a me proposition, right? Although, if you if you're an introvert, sometimes it is a me proposition. But as you mentioned, once we have the thing, right? If we're trying to find happiness through purchasing goods, that ultimately, through hedonic adaptation, it's going to lose the utility. Through experience, we know that we can savor that moment because it was never meant to, give us a lift. It was meant to experience. And so that's one thing. The other is unpacking social media a little bit. And again, this gets into neuroscience and sort of at the edge of my academic understanding. But in interviewing several neurologists for the book, so let me clarify that we now know that dopamine isn't the pleasure-seeking neurotransmitter that we thought, right? It's meant to excite us. We know that dopamine gets released when we anticipate a pleasurable experience. So that's why social media is so powerful, right? We're kind of waiting for what that next picture is. We call it a variable reward in psychology. And what that's doing is limiting our ability to access to oxytocin when we actually engage in pro-social behavior. And so to say that you're getting one and not the other, that's why I'm making this a little bit more verbose than it needs to be, because I'm not trying to simplify neuroscience. But what we do know is that pleasure that really lifts us up really requires both those neurochemicals. And that doesn't happen when we're getting just access to our friends' history through these social channels. So we are tricked into believing it because we kind of get this little boost, when we see these pictures and we feel like we're connected and like, oh, we're keeping up with these folks. But what we really need, and what kind of helps us feel like we're connected to something bigger than ourselves is true connection. And so now they're just scratching the surface of like, it tends to be real eye-to-eye contact. So they're trying to see like this Zoom meeting that we're having now, is that a better choice than kind of keeping up, passively through social media? But what we know is kind of the, gold standard is face-to-face interaction, right? I mean, that's why loneliness is an epidemic coming out of the pandemic. And we know that at least from a correlative standpoint, that loneliness tends to have worse health outcomes than sitting and smoking. And that's quite profound, right? And so when we're talking about what is important, building opportunities for connection through experience, I think has been validated as one of the most important things that we can do. And generally those are pleasurable and fun, right? Like if you're not having fun with your friends, they tend not to be friends very long. So that's where I make the dotted line to why fun is important, because fun tends to be the glue to continually do these things. And to your point, they don't have to be, this grand episodic gesture at the end of the year where you're spending all your money at the end. Quite the opposite. You want to make sure that it's sustainable. Here, in the US and Canada, it's awful. We have to incentivize people to take, we have some of the worst time off policies, in the globe at 2 weeks as being an average. I think France is 6, right?
Yeah.
And we're not even taking them. Corporations realize that this leads to better productivity, so they're not even doing it for benevolent causes. And they're literally having to incentivize people. And there's reasons for that. I mean, oftentimes we believe, we still have this Puritan work ethic where we believe that if we're not living through a sense of duty and pain, that we're not living a quote unquote spiritual life. But now we have the evidence to prove that that's killing us slowly. Right. And so anyways, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I want to just go quickly back to social media, because I would even say that most of the people that I'm working with don't really have a dopamine release in regards to, really getting this it's more like self judgment that comes as an outcome. And so, I have many young people that I work with that tell me that they are glued to it, but afterwards they feel really bad about themselves and unmotivated even to go with their dog walking or something like this, a very simple experience. So how do you get people to get more motivated, to have more fun, direct experiences on their own or with others?
Yeah, so one of the interventions that I often use at the beginning of any engagement that I have is to do a simple time audit, right? There's only 168 hours in our week. I use something that I created. All of us tend to create simple 4-quadrant models, and I did. And so I call it the play model. And it's really just matching up effort with valence, so what can you engage in, that brings you pleasure. And so you do the time audit, and then you look at your activities in that given week. And the acronym is PLAY. So it stands for pleasing, living, agonizing, and yielding. And the pleasing and living categories are the ones where you're operating in positive valence. And so you would quickly identify that time on social media is in the yielding category. That's not really creating any pleasure for you, right? Because even by your own admission, your patients, clients are admitting that it's not lighting them up, right? So what can we do as a replacement activity during this time that you're basically wasting? And so in that, you want to identify what are the moments of discomfort when you're going through your social media feed, right? For some folks, it's going to be, I really want to connect with these friends, and I just have lost those social graces during the pandemic. So it's as simple as, okay, well, identify 2 or 3 people you can connect with. If 2 of them aren't ready yet either, then that's fine, but find someone so that you can start to engage in pro-social behavior. If, the fear of missing out, this comparison paradox that we've been talking about is it, and it's not necessarily loneliness. What can you do to identify one of the things that was bringing you discomfort while you were, and actually move yourself towards that? And so, the main thing about that, again, why happiness is problematic is that we do compare. And when you have this fire hose of comparison coming at you, where you can see 100 different things that you're not doing, then all of a sudden your brain has this huge amount of cognitive load that it has to sift through, right? Like, here are all these things that my friends are doing. And oftentimes we don't realize that that's a curated life of someone that's probably more miserable than you are, right? I mean, we know that, again, empirically, because we know most people that overpost are folks that have high affiliation needs and are likely depressed themselves, right? As a generalization, I'm not throwing that, at everyone, but, and I certainly like social media because I've learned how to tame it. And I think it's a great tool to share and to stay connected, but I limit myself, right? And so those are 2 helpful strategies that I found, or really 3, right? What is the replacement activity? Because we know that, I think it's fair to say that it's, for a lot of us, it's a budding addiction, right? It's not a true addiction, but certainly a budding addiction. And the best way to mitigate addiction is to find a replacement behavior, right? And so that leads to the other two of the best replacement behaviors that will mitigate the discomfort that you had through engaging in social media too much is, 1, connecting with the folks that you wanted to see in the first place and creating real world memories, or moving yourself towards one of those activities that's, causing you discomfort because, what we call FOMO, right? The fear of missing out.
I completely agree. And I think it's discipline that gets us there. And And it's probably, something we really have to also feel the pain, because we're not so aware of the pain that we are gaining from engaging in those things. Just like in the good old days, watching too much TV, it was just also something that eventually you felt a little yucky afterwards, because you haven't really engaged in life. You have just engaged in the screen. And for me, that's a similarity, but now it's certainly more on social media, and it feels more as if we are connecting. We are not really connecting, as you just pointed out.
Yeah, and if you can't get over the friction, some people, kind of get stuck. Well, I don't know if I want to do a 1 week time audit, even though it ends up being a lot easier than most people feel. I mean, now Android and iPhones have the ability for you to quickly look at how much time you're consuming apps. So that's usually a great gateway into actually doing a time audit. Like, wait, I was on Instagram 12 hours this week. You were.
How
The
did that
data doesn't
happen?
lie, right?
Well, one of the questions I had for you was also about the misconceptions around happiness. So what are those misconceptions? We may have covered already some, but what are those that you haven't talked about?
Yeah, I mean, primarily that it's something to be overly concerned with, right? And so we have touched on most of them, and that is that it does become problematic, that it is this leading indicator, and oftentimes requires introspection. So it's not necessarily an in the moment emotion. We have this broad breadth of emotions, but that being overly concerned about it is going to lead to negative outcomes. And so I think that is the main misconception. Is it this thing that I should optimize for? And ultimately, if having more pleasure in your life, inviting more delight and joy, there's better avenues for doing that, rather than being concerned about some future state. And that taking action in the moment and being more mindful of the activities that you engage in are a lot better way to feel like you're living a fulfilled life. Because again, the way that we built this construct of happiness and how problematic it is.
Now, coming back to the beginning where you talked about how you got on this journey, what habits have changed for you? What do you think, like personally, is now what you do differently or better than before?
Yeah, so I look at, from time to time, I do that time audit, and I try to, one, limit the amount of time for introspection, right? So we know, and I know that your specialty is in anxiety, right? Like, one of the most useful tools for someone that has that slant, which I've already confessed I do, is to sort of time box the amount of time you're willing to do that, right? Because we know that if you eliminate it altogether, it's going to manifest in your subconscious in very strange ways, right? And so the same can be done for folks that want to be happy and spend a little bit of time, being mindful about how that might look. But, finding the amount of time that works for you in any given week, and then capping yourself so that you're not kind of lost in your own perseveration with regards to your emotional state. For me, what I've done is set aside some time on Sunday to be more pragmatic about how I'm going to spend my time in any given week. And then I have some checks and balances of, so I use various apps that do tell me, like, hey, you spent more time than you had allocated, on this particular activity. And then I'll find ways to, to switch out those activities for things that are more pleasurable. And then I have a set of tools that I call Savor. And so the S stands for story editing. And so oftentimes, if I find myself sort of wallowing in a particular activity, I'll try and figure out how I can reframe it so that, it sort of leads me in a better direction. A stands for activity bundling. So if there's something that I don't necessarily enjoy, like, let's say, cleaning my bathroom, I'll try and figure out, is there something that I can add on to it that kind of increases the pleasure of that activity? So oftentimes for me, it's listening to a podcast. Variable hedonics, we've talked about quite a bit, and that is, how can I vary up activities? So I'm, this work is based with Barbara Fredrickson. How can I broaden and build those breadths of activities? And then O stands for options, and that is oftentimes one of the the easiest things to do, but something that I find that a lot of folks don't because it requires an extra step. And that is, if I do kind of feel stuck, how can I develop a set of options that allows me to have better choices, in any given circumstance? And oftentimes it's just asking yourself that simple question: is there another way to do that? So an anecdote that I often bring up, especially, when I'm on podcasts that have a parenting slant, is my wife and I found that bathing our young children was this truly agonizing activity because for whatever reason, they didn't like us to do it. And my wife and I always tried to pawn it off on the other person because it just wasn't that fun. And so we found, to make a long story short, we found that we didn't, because we couldn't afford, nor did we need a nanny, but we were able to bring in someone that could babysit them just a few hours out of the week during that bath time experience, bathe them, and that gave us an opportunity to reconnect as partners during that time. So it was just a subtle shift of how we were spending 4 hours. Well, now our kids had amazing time, with this babysitter during bath time because she's young and has more vitality than us. And now my wife and I have a couple of date nights a week, so we're able to reconnect as partners and then come back to our children, much better people. And then the last one is reminiscing, and we talked about that as well. When I have some downtime, instead of getting myself on social media, I'll reminisce about some fun times. So I have pictures, instead of Facebook's algorithm, sort of telling me what I should remember. I have various containers of memories that I want to remember, and so I'll pick it up. So again, flexing that agency and autonomy, so that I'm in control of what I remember because I know what I like. And oftentimes those are great cues, right? They create this sort of mechanism like, hey, like here's another picture of my best friend. Like I haven't talked to Micah for a while, after reminiscing, and that will, create the trigger to reach out to him. And, so again, that upward spiral, right, of pleasurable and fun activities.
I love that you ask someone else to bathe the children and said, okay, this is great because now we have more date night, rather than think, oh, we are failing, we have to do this better, we have to learn. And you just accepted that you're not the best bathers and that someone else can do it better. And it didn't seem to be something that you were having a hard time with. Once you find a solution.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing, especially for adults, right, that becomes the hardest part of this transition to finding more pleasurable activities, that so many of us feel this sense of duty, right? Whether it's relinquishing friendships of convenience, right? Because that's just what we do, or something intimate like bathing our children. Like, why is it okay for rich people that can afford a nanny to allow them to do some of these more intimate things? But for us, it's somehow hard because it's a bit unorthodox to just hire someone to do that activity, and challenging those assumptions through reframing. That becomes difficult because change is always hard, and we become, like neuroplasticity is more difficult as we age, right? Like this is how we do it, so this is how we do it. But challenging those assumptions are some of the best ways to sort of get out of things that really can be agonizing, and so thanks for that. I do.
I'm inspired. Last question. People, as you said before, think work is holy and you cannot really cut into it. You have to pay the bills. You have to yada yada. So how do you get people, if you do your time allocation overview and they work 12 hours a day, how do you get them to work less or get them to find more pleasure in their lives if work is their big excuse?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is important, again, this is research that comes out of Stanford and Harvard, and that is that when you're not living a fulfilling life, so when you feel like your life is full of drudgery, you tend not to produce as much. So the folks where they value work and this sort of Puritan work ethic, one of the easiest ways to get them over the hump is a simple math equation, right? So if you're feeling fulfilled and you're not feeling burnt out, then you can contribute, let's say, 2 amounts of productivity per every hour, right? But if you're worn out and you're and you're working 50 to 60 hours a week, then let's say 55, right? You're only able to produce 1 unit of output per week, right? So would you rather be the person working 30 hours a week producing 2 units of work, or working 55 hours and producing only 1, where you're actually producing more output of productivity, in the first example? And this has been empirically validated over and over again. Again, that's why US corporations are insisting people take vacation now, even though we've been so conditioned not to do it, right? And oftentimes it takes me, pointing them to these studies, but hands down, again and again, folks that feel like they're living a more fulfilled life are also more productive at work. And so that usually gets them over the hump, right? But behavior change is hard, right? So oftentimes what I'll say, and this work comes from Dr. Cassie Holmes out of UCLA, she found this sort of Goldilocks spot, right? Like, figure out 2 hours out of your 24 a day that you can kind of take off, take for yourself, take off the table for yourself. And if you can't do that, or if you can't even find 1 a day, then you need to start questioning why that is, right? Because even doctors, physicians, folks, all sorts of professions, consultants, things of that nature, that are, sort of bound by long hours, can still find an hour or 2 out of their day. And you find time and time again, when people do these time audits, that they're not even finding 1 or 2 hours out of their week. And oftentimes that, slowly adding in 1 hour a week, so that they're at least enjoying 4 to 7 hours a week, is kind of the baby step into that. But
Well, I think that's very well said, but the problem is also that they often don't know what to do with themselves. So even if they do not, work 12 hours a day, I think just having, like you have given many tools, if they have already something that they feel like, okay, I can replace the work time with something simple, because I often hear, well, I tried meditating, but that didn't work, because their mind is racing like crazy. So there are other things to find pleasure or peace than meditation, and just making it simple and having something already waiting for you to, get used to it and have a new habit of those 2 hours that bring you fun and pleasure. That's just also something that people have to gradually grow into. It's not a light switch that, we can now work less and all of a sudden feel so much happier. I'm sure it just takes a little bit.
Yeah, and there are 2 things to unpack there, because I like meditating, but it's similar to gratitude. I actually write about it in the book, where I was using a muse, because again, I'm kind of a quantified geek. And what really annoyed me about the muse, and like Sam Harris, I've now moved on to Sam Harris's Waking Up app, and he finally just relinquished this feature. But like all of these apps, they're meant to help you meditate, but oftentimes the mechanisms behind them are still built by product people, right?
Exactly.
So the muse kept saying, hey, you meditated great this week. Why don't you add another hour next week? Like,
it's never enough.
Not what I want to do, And so people can get burnt out by things that are supposed to make them feel better, right? And so, and what's important to unpack there is all of these tools, right, that can be helpful, all still have a U-shaped curve, right?
Yeah.
So you might be on the Six Sigma where this isn't right for you. That doesn't mean give up. It just means that that meditation isn't for you. There's gonna be something out there,
Yes,
that's gonna lift you up. And so that's important to know, that, if one intervention hasn't worked for you, you just move on. It's not, you didn't fail. You used that terminology earlier. And that's why a growth mindset is so important when you're kind of moving through this, right? Is realizing that it's okay. Failure is part of the process. The second thing I think that's important, in conjunction with what I already shared, that's again kind of paradoxical, is that figuring out whatever that activity for you is. And oftentimes what I'll ask folks to do is look back at like what they enjoyed when they did have more free time. So oftentimes, the one that stands out, it's not for me, but it's a true standout, especially for women, is dancing. And so but I just don't have the energy to dance. And again, it's one of those things where if you make time for it, yes, you might be a little bit more tired when you get home, but you're going to sleep better. And 9 times out of 10, engaging in an activity that lights you up gives you more vitality. And it usually takes a couple of weeks, so that's the unfortunate thing. Like, you try it for a week and mainly just because of muscle memory and things of that nature, and just getting used to, you know, your new routine. It will make you feel like, oh, okay, well, I like this, but I just don't have the energy for it. But usually about week 3, you'll realize, wow, I have more energy than I've ever had, because that type of activity redistributes, you know, positive neurochemicals, and way better than, you know, binge watching Netflix again for, you know, another month. And so again, that's another thing that's been empirically validated, but often is hard for folks to put into practice, because it, you know, just like, you know, some of these pharmaceutical interventions, we don't know why it is, but it takes a couple of weeks for the body to adapt to these, you know, these elements that kind of change your neurochemistry. And so
Well, I'm sure that's by design pretty smart, because if everything would go right away and quickly, we probably would kill ourselves with our thoughts. So it's good that everything takes a little bit longer. Now, how can people find your book and find out more about you?
Thanks for that opportunity. Yeah, so the book's available for pre-sale now. So even though it's not coming out till January 3rd, wherever you buy books, you can purchase it. And I write about the science of fun at my website, michaelrucker.com.
And the book is called?
The Fun Habit.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael. This was fantastic. So much information to unpack. I mean, I have to watch this several times to get it all in. I really appreciate the time that you take.
I appreciate you having me. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Hi, Dr. Friedemann here. Thank you for tuning into my YouTube channel. If you're interested in learning more about fear and anxiety, here you'll find guided meditations, webinars, and interviews with some of the most renowned experts in the field of empowerment. Delve into the over 230 videos and more to come every week.